All right, is this thing on? Can everybody hear me all right? Are we good? Okay, I'm pretty loud. Well, my name is Joel Bourne. I want to thank Deb Royals and the Justice Theater Project for, first of all, putting on this wonderful play and inviting me here to talk to you about my experiences in Louisiana. Thanks to the Justice Theater Project for having me. Because, again, the way we tell stories, whether they're fiction or nonfiction, is how we relate to our world. It's since Plato's time and, the Iliad, we tell stories. And so what you'll see today is a fictional story. What I've done through most of my career is nonfiction. So I am an environmental reporter. I grew up in eastern North Carolina. I got to Geographic in about 2000, but I had worked in Louisiana before on various other publications. I went down there in the early 90s originally to talk about their wetland loss. They've got a huge issue. They've got the largest wetlands in the United States. They're the breeding grounds for about a third of all our seafood. And they've been losing them faster than in any other area of the United States, almost any other area in the world, the rate, since about 1940. Part of that reason is because the Mississippi River, which used to spill over and flood every year and rebuild its delta, is now a big concrete channel where ships go back and forth, and they don't want it to flood at all. And so it's been starved of its sediments. But the other half of that equation has to do with the oil and gas industry. And as you probably see today, the oil and gas industry, the fishing industry, and southern Louisiana are hand in glove. This is an industry that brings $60 billion into state coffers every year. At one point, it was half of the budget of the state of Louisiana was coming from the oil and gas industry. And the job numbers vary between 50 and 60,000 for the state. But because they've had offshore oil drilling in Louisiana since 1947, very first offshore rig was built in Houma, Louisiana, and you can still go see it. It's a museum now, and right behind the big flood wall. But because they've had that, they have cut their marshes up for a fare thee well. Pipeline canals, drilling rig canals, barge canals, so that they've changed the entire hydrography of the marsh, which has allowed seawater to intrude and fresh water to go back and the marshes to sink, through erosion, through salinization, and through this massive hydraulic change. So I was down there in the beginning and working for a couple of small magazines, and when I got to National Geographic, I like to joke, they have Egyptian experts, they have people who are fluent in all different kind of languages, and because I came from eastern North Carolina and grew up with a bunch of farmers and fishermen, I spoke fluent redneck. And so anytime there was an oil or a fisheries issue, they kind of said, oh, well, send Bourne down there. He knows how to talk to those folks. So I'm like, okay, I'm happy to do that because I'm kind of a mud rat anyway, and I love going down in the marsh. So after the wetland loss issue, we had Katrina. And I did a big story about the wetland loss for Geographic as well, and where we postulated what would happen if a Cat 5 hurricane hit the city. And 10 months later, a Cat 3 hurricane hit the city and did pretty much exactly what all the experts said it was going to do. Just devastated it. And they have still yet to recover. They're still about, last figures I saw, about 60% of their population. And business is way down. They're having a real struggle. So we had just gotten over that, and we were talking about, well, let's do an anniversary story on Katrina when what happens but the Deepwater Horizon. And again, this was not something that happened overnight. Your government and my government encouraged the big oil industry to go offshore in 1995, go into deep water off the continental shelf into the Gulf of Mexico by saying you can have royalty-free for the next 4 years. Anybody that goes over 1,000 feet, have at it, boys. Go. This was part of the deal where they were trying to do unconventional oil and gas resources for the United States. And so part of that was fracking and the shale oil gas that we're now seeing, both, possibly coming to North Carolina, but all over the central parts of the states. Part of it was deep and ultra-deep oil off the coast of Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, in the Gulf of Mexico. And now it contributes 30% of all our oil and gas revenues coming out of the deep water of the Gulf. Well, sorry, of the Gulf. Half of that is deep water. A third of that is ultra deep water, over 5,000 feet. These are areas that we have never drilled before since they just started drilling sort of 1997-ish when they started going ultra deep. So I want to read you a little bit about sort of the nut of this very, very long story that Geographic asked me to write very quickly during the summer of 2010 to give you some idea of what both the company and the environment was kind of up against. And in the Deepwater Horizon spill, as you'll probably see in this production, there was a lot of blame to go around. Not just blame for the industry or the people who were actually on the well, but the people who actually spurred them to go out there to look for this, along with our own very deep, very unsustainable addiction to oil resources in the United States. Some deep water wells go in relatively easy. The Macondo well did not. BP hired Transocean, a Switzerland-based company, to drill the well. And Transocean's first drill rig was knocked out of commission by Hurricane Ida after just a month. The Deepwater Horizon began its ill-fated effort in February 2010 and ran into problems almost from the start. In early March, the drill pipe got stuck in the borehole, as did the tool sent down to find the stuck section. The drillers had to back out and drill around the obstruction. A BP email later released by Congress mentioned that the drillers were having well control problems. Another email from a consultant stated, "We flipped the design parameters around to the point that I got nervous." A week before the explosion, a BP drilling engineer wrote, "This has been a nightmare well." By April 20th, the Deepwater Horizon was 6 weeks behind schedule, and the delay was costing BP more than $500,000 a day. BP had chosen to drill the well in the fastest way possible, using a design known as the long string, because it places strings of casing pipe between the oil reservoir and the wellhead. A long string generally has two barriers between the reservoir and the blowout preventer on the seafloor, a cement plug at the bottom of the well and a metal seal known as a lockdown sleeve placed right at the wellhead on the seafloor. The lockdown sleeve had not been installed when the Macondo well blew out. In addition, congressional investigators and industry experts contend that BP cut corners on its cement job. It failed to circulate the heavy drilling mud outside the casing before cementing, a practice that helps the cement cure properly. It didn't put in enough centralizers, devices that ensure that cement forms a complete seal around the casing, and it failed to run a test to see if the cement had bonded properly. Finally, just before the accident, BP replaced the heavy drilling mud in the well with much lighter seawater as it prepared to finish and disconnect on the rig from the well. BP declined to comment on these matters, citing the ongoing investigation when I was reporting it. All of these decisions may have been perfectly legal, and they surely saved BP time and money, yet each one increased the risks of a blowout. On the night of April 20th, investigators suspect a large gas bubble somehow infiltrated the casing, perhaps through the gaps in the cement, and shot straight up the well. The blowout preventer should have stopped the powerful kick, as the drillers call it, on the sea floor. Its heavy hydraulic rams were supposed to shear the drill pipe like a soda straw, blocking the upward surge and protecting the rig above. But that fail-safe device had itself been beset by leaks and maintenance problems. When a geyser of drilling mud erupted onto the rig, all attempts to activate the blowout preventer failed. Now, for this story, I interviewed the head of the Petroleum Safety Directorate in Norway. Now, Norway has been drilling high-pressure wells in its shallow coastal plain in the North Sea for about 20 years. They're very good at safety. They have not had a blowout since 1987. And when I explained what the BP guys had done, and the Norwegians were on this like, a duck on a bug, I said, would you guys have allowed BP to drill this well in Norway like this? And here's what he said. The decision BP made when they had indications that the well was not stable, the decision to have only one long pipe, the decision to have only 6 centralizers instead of 21 to create the best possible cement job, some of these things were very surprising to us here. Now, what he told me off the record was no way in hell would they have allowed BP to drill a well like that in Norway. It just would not have happened. Now, the last thing I'll read you, and then we can talk a little more in depth. part of it, I went out, for this reporting, I went out to the well site where it was going gangbusters in the middle of the Gulf. And I don't know if you guys have ever been around an oil spill, or you remember maybe when they're paving the road and you smell that asphalt? Well, think of the Gulf, which once you get outside of the littoral zone of the Mississippi River is turquoise blue, gin clear, fish everywhere, gorgeous, almost Caribbean-like color. And it's covered with this sort of reddish brown goo that smells just like when you're driving by a paving machine. It is absolutely heartbreaking both to see and watch. And there were a lot of dedicated and hardworking men and women and engineers who were out there trying to cap that thing, and my hat's off to them. But the results were heartbreaking for anybody who loves clean water, clean fish, and environment. But we all bear a little bit of responsibility because, you know, we all drove here today with gas in our tanks, and 1 out of 3 gallons comes from the Gulf of Mexico. So a part of this responsibility lies on us all. And when I was out there, I was with a geologist named Sandy Joy from the University of Georgia. Wonderful deep sea ocean geologist who deals with ocean chemistry, and she looks at these seeps and vents on the bottom of the ocean floor. And she was the one who found, you may remember, the cloud, the plume that was sort of wafting around deep, deep in the Gulf of Mexico. And she said, in summary, you know, the Deepwater Horizon incident is a direct consequence of our global addiction to oil. Incidents like this are inevitable as we drill in deeper and deeper waters. We're playing a very dangerous game here. If this isn't a call to green power, I don't know what is. Now, about a month ago, I was down in Wilmington where I live now, and there was a public hearing by the new Bureau of Office of Oil Resources Management Regulation. It's the thing that Minerals Management Service became. They renamed it this thing whose acronym is funny. It's BUMMER. And whatever, you know, apparatchik came up with that was really funny. And as I was listening to the people in Wilmington, North Carolina think, there were a lot of people there with natural gas equals jobs and drill baby drill stickers all over their clothing. And I don't begrudge them that. But what they need to know is that when the Presidential Commission that investigated this blowout came up with its final results last year, they summed it up by saying that the Deepwater Horizon incident was an entirely preventable series of corporate and regulatory mistakes, and that unless the industry and regulators cleaned up their act, another such incident was inevitable. Now, earlier that month, the director of the newly renamed BUMMER told Reuters that his agency lacks the resources, personnel, training, technology, enforcement, tools, regulation, and legislation it needs to do its job properly. So we're back drilling in the deep waters of the Gulf right now, going hammer and tongs. Not just here in the United States, but we're drilling in the deep waters off Brazil, we're drilling in the deep waters off Africa and Angola, where there are very few environmental safeguards. The same companies, same drillers, same people. So unless and until we change our oil habits, every now and then we're going to have to deal with the consequences. And we should never forget that 11 guys, you know, lost their lives when this thing went up. And that's 11 families that don't have their daddy to go home to. One last thing I'll tell you, which I always find interesting, and then if there are any questions you want to ask, we'll have a discussion. The U.S. Census comes up with an interesting statistic about every 10 years. The most transient community in the United States and the least transient community. And this is a factor of how many people move in and move out, you know. And the most transient community is always in Nevada. People go to Nevada. I don't know why. They look for jobs. They want to play in the casinos. But they always go, they lose their money, and then they leave. The least transient communities in the United States are always tiny little towns in Louisiana, where people just basically don't want to leave. They pick up, they go to high school, and they buy the house 3 doors down from Mama, and they have Sunday dinner at Mama's every day, and they hunt and they fish, and they love where they live. I have never seen people so in love with their community as I have in Southeast Louisiana or Southwest Louisiana. And I'll tell you this one last story. When I was doing the Katrina story, I went and I interviewed a gentleman who lived in the lower 9th Ward, whose name, oddly enough, was Robert Johnson, just like the guitar player who was supposed to sell his soul to the devil. Mr. Johnson has built his house with his own hands. He was probably 70 at the time. And it was right behind the industrial canal where the barge broke through, flooded the whole 9th Ward, and just by the grace of God, his house was not decimated, although it flooded to the roof. He was back there rebuilding his house. And so I was down there having red beans and rice with him one afternoon. I said, Mr. Johnson, let me ask you a question. If I give you a flood-free house, a flood-proof house, over in this part of the high ground of the city, there's a blighted area in the warehouse district that's above sea level that they were talking about renovating for the people in the lower 9th. If I buy your house at full flood, pre-flood value, give you a brand new house of the same size and value in this area that would not flood, would you take it? And he looked at me like I was from Mars and said, why on earth would I want to move over there? In the lower 9th, my family's here, my church is here, my friends are here. I built this house with my own hands. It's paid for. Why in the heck would I want to move over there? That's how local and committed these people are to that little patch of land we call Louisiana. So with that, I'll open up any questions. It's been 2 years since I've reported on the story. I told Deb I've been doing other things, so I'll try to remember as best I can. But I'm happy to answer any questions you guys might have before we see the play.
Do you know how many people left and then have returned? I know they were trying to get them to other states. Do you have any idea on that?
From Katrina?
Yeah.
I get updates from the Greater New Orleans Commission. And the last one I remember paying attention to, there were about 1 million before Katrina hit, and about 60% of return. So maybe 500, 600,000. And it's been a complete demographic shift. A lot of people in the lower parishes, St. Bernard, Plaquemines, moved above the lake, moved above Lake Pontchartrain up toward Baton Rouge. So there was this huge, even almost natural, well, unnatural migration of people who had one too many floods and just were not going to rebuild anymore. And one of the sad things about that particular story is that flooding didn't have to happen either. When Betsy hit in '69, they had the full money to build Cat 3 protection all around the city at the time. And the city father said, nah, you know what, we'd like to expand. We want to go out there in the swamp and build new land out there. And they convinced their congressman and the Army Corps, and they threw a big old ring levee around East New Orleans. And it's now 15 to 16 feet below sea level. And it got hit hard because it was on swampland that they just filled, and it went shoom. And a bunch of big Texas developers in the late 60s, early 70s, including Lady Bird Johnson's family's company, was part of that. And they just, and then it was white flight to the suburbs. But in that particular case, it was black flight to the suburbs, because the middle class blacks that were in New Orleans were wanting a better life. And they wanted to get out where the poor schools were and get over there and buy a house. And so it was tragic what happened to them, just tragic, because they built a beautiful community out there that was 11 feet below sea level, 11 to 13. Yes, ma'am.
So I know that you have done some reporting since then on alternative forms of fuel.
Mm-hmm. I have.
Tell me a little.
Well,
where do you think we're going, given that addiction probably is not going to decrease too much?
Well, here's the thing. We now get 10% of our fuel in the United States from corn ethanol. 40% of our entire corn crop goes into our cars now. The whole argument about offshore oil providing us with oil independence so we don't have to import anymore from the Gulf states, well, the United States is going to be oil independent by 2020 based on corn ethanol, shale oil, deep water Gulf, and the fact that CAFE standards, our fuel economy, is ratcheting up, and the fact that we're slowing down. We're not driving as much as we used to. So if we're talking about offshore North Carolina, we will be off Arab oil long before we could ever stick one bit off the coast of North Carolina coast. And we'll be exporting it to China. Now, in terms of alternative fuels, there will probably be a big push to get into natural gas. It's easy to convert a car to natural gas, costs about $1,000. Natural gas now is very cheap. There's the infrastructure that's available. You can do it. They've been running it in Brazil forever. The other possibility way is to increase ethanol that we burn in our gasoline-powered cars. That's going to take a little more money and a little more effort, but we could probably go to a quarter of our fuel from corn. That has problems because it causes the price of grain to rise all over the world, and so starving people that we normally would export our grain to have to pay a gazillion more, 3 or 4 times more for it than they would have. So there's a moral issue involved with that. Biofuels, the greenest ones are still, this is the frustrating thing. We were supposed to get about 10% of our biofuel from non-food sources by this time. Well, the EPA has been rolling that back because the technology has not got up to the point where they can make it in a cost-effective manner yet. It's very expensive to make green fuel out of cellulose. So they're still trying. The Navy, believe it or not, is pushing it harder than anybody else because they are the largest single consumer of oil on the planet, the U.S. Navy. And so they have an enormous and well-funded green fuel program, and they're trying camelina, they're trying all these different things. The one thing that will work, once they get the technology right, is algae. And I went to see one of these plants out in the West once, and algae has the potential to do a lot of things, both for food, for feeding aquaculture fish, and for fuel. So keep your eye on algae and algae technology for the next 20 years. We're all going to be like Soylent Green. Do you remember that movie where we're all eating crackers of Soylent? Yeah.
Other questions?
Yes, ma'am.
What would it take for the oil companies to come up to snuff? Like you were saying, they're just not qualified in many ways to be doing what they're doing. Is it legal problems? Is it political? Is the law missing somewhere?
That's a very good question. Before this spill, I had to get a hazardous certification to go out by the rig. And so I called my local Coast Guard commander, who I knew down in Wilmington, and said, "Do you provide this training?" He said, "Sure." And he said, "Oh, and by the way, I used to be based in Galveston. I used to inspect the rigs." I'm like, "No kidding. How'd that work?" And he said, "Man, it was the toughest job I ever had. I would be crawling down the legs. We have to do the safety inspecting just like a ship." And I said, "Well, did you ever see the minerals management guys out there?" He busted out laughing. He said, oh yeah, they fly out in the helicopter, they spend 30 minutes eating lunch, and then they fly away. He said, I don't know what the hell they're inspecting if it's not the rig kitchen, because that's about all they saw. And I'm like, oh, okay. So there is a huge, now here's, I guess one way to put this is, the oil industry, as you know, the largest industry in the world, has enormous political sway over our government. They contribute $6.5 billion to federal coffers every year. I think it's the number one source of revenue for the U.S. government after taxes, is offshore royalties. So they swatted them with a fly swatter, essentially. Now, the Norwegians, it's a different culture. It's very safety-oriented. It's very quasi-governmental. The government and the industry work very closely together to make sure nobody dies on the rig. They've got this safety culture, whereas some of the Norwegian guys I was talking to, even who worked for the big Statoil Norwegian company, are like, you guys are cowboys. It's the culture. You guys are just cowboys. You're going out there, you're taking these enormous risks, you're making enormous profits when it works, but when it fails, boom. You're not doing the steady Eddie thing. You're doing the red O'Dare. Let's go drill some oil. Let's see that spouter come out of the ground thing. And so there's a culture. And one of the guys I even interviewed, Bob B. from UC Berkeley, he used to work for ARCO. He's an oil and gas petroleum engineer, built these huge structures off on the coast of Mexico, then went to Berkeley and started studying risk safety, risk assessment. And he said, you know, one of BP's problems is when they merged with ARCO, they had all these old guys working for ARCO who had enormous field experience. And they early retired them all. And because they didn't want to pay the pension. And so they started contracting out all their expertise. So the rig, you know, the company man was in charge of the rig, but the second, number 2 guy was the contractor. And he was drilling the well. And so the company man's dealing with the numbers, and that guy's dealing with the safety and the drilling of the well. And they often have 2 differing objectives. And the company guy's objective is to drill the well quickly, as safely as possible, while cheaply as possible, because it's a profit game. So, and they're taking enormous risks. You know, they're spending $1 million, $500,000 to $1 million a day on that rig. So, you know, that's just how capitalism works. Yes, ma'am.
What could the public do to encourage a different approach?
That's a real good question. You know, the one thing that the public always has over the companies with the money is you have the vote and you have the dollars in your pocket, which they won't. So if collectively we can vote in people who are interested in safety and coastal resources, which are very important to all of us, by the way, or we can say, BP, we don't want to actually buy from you anymore. We're going to go buy from Hugo Chavez because we think he's drilling better down in Venezuela, which he's not. But, you know, we're going to vote with our dollar. Like the interesting thing, Exxon Valdez, you saw all the oil pups and the workers up in Alaska, and oh my God, you know, everything's going. You know, there was a huge, boycott of Exxon and Exxon products. Anybody boycott BP? Anybody not go to a BP station? You did? I stopped going to them for a while, but there was no conservative, let's boycott BP. You didn't see that. It was amazing to me oh man, what a bummer response from the American public. I mean, we're fascinated by the 24-hour-a-day cameras that were on the well, but the connection between that and the BP, the big Petunia station down the road, it was kind of lost. Yeah.
Just to that point, maybe you can speak to this with some of your interviews. I know in our family we did boycott BP, but then there seemed to be an outcry from people living in the Gulf that we need this for our economy. Well, this was a bad thing. We don't want you to boycott BP. So can you speak to that?
Yes. Well, again, this goes hand in glove. The regular guy in Louisiana, puts one hand in a shrimp boat, one pair of pants in a shrimp boat and the other one on his oil rig boot. And they go hand in hand. They are just two, and every shrimper down there has got a brother, sister, mother who works in the oil industry. It is just hand in glove. And so when you put a moratorium on them, they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. We don't have any shrimp anymore. We got to do something for a living. And yet, they know that the louder they cry for their shrimp resources, they know they've got a charismatic sort of good old boy fisherman that can get a lot of sympathy and a lot of attention. They will hit, they're not dumb. I mean, they're Cajun smart. And they will hit that drum as long as they can because, they're right. Their livelihood has been destroyed. I mean, it's coming back. It's not dead forever. But there's a lot of, fiddle playing going on down in Louisiana, which is another thing that's cool about it. And I don't know if we'll see it today, but it's one of the only states I've ever seen where old people dance. They just dance. They love to dance. You see these Cajuns in these little old juke joints, and they dance better and more vigorously than I do, that's for sure. And you got to love a culture that dances well until its 90s. That's just...
There was a question right here on the front row.
Sure.
Yes. I was just wondering, in your time of interviewing people specifically for the oil spill, did you find any hesitation for people to come forward and be honest, or were people generally welcoming to you and ready to give out information?
BP put the fear of God in everybody down there. It was a very difficult story to report because, first of all, they tried to hire everybody and make them sign non-disclosure things, which means that if you speak to a reporter, we'll sue you. And whenever any reporter, like my colleagues, got chased off of all kinds of places, by big guys who were hired by BP to keep reporters out. So anytime you saw an oil pelican and the photographer wanted to go up and shoot it, there was, if there was a BP hired guard in a boat around, he was going to try to get in the way. And you know, there were people, like, there are always good people who work on these things. And you know, if you're talking to them honestly without the tape on or without a camera in their face, they'll let you know how it goes. Like, I was talking to one lady in a bar, was having dinner in New Orleans. It turns out she was a shell engineer. And she said, you know, I had a friend whose brother was on the rig, and they've got this policy on the rig. If you ever feel unsafe, you can get off on the next plane or the next helicopter going. They've always got coppers going back and forth. And he peeled off the day before it blew. So they knew the thing, at least one person knew the thing was unstable. And I was talking to the guy who was in charge of the burn boats, who were burning all the oil off the coast, which is a god-awful thing. You see this huge plume of black smoke. And he's a good old Louisiana guy, Nere Mabille. And he said, as I was interviewing him, he said, yeah, we're doing this, blah, 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 50,000 barrels a day. And at that point, they were only saying 5. And I called him back up and I said, Nere, I got in my notes here, you said 50,000 barrels a day. No, man, I didn't know. I misspoke, man. I couldn't have said that. No, that was wrong. I knew that was wrong. No, if it was only 5. I know I said, you just jotted it down wrong. But I couldn't prove it. And I didn't want to burn Nere. But they knew how much oil was coming out of there. They make every barrel that comes out of there cost them money. They know to the ounce. And plus, when it's spilling, they also know that for every barrel that is counted, it goes against them in the damage assessment assessed by the federal government. So the more they can obfuscate the amount and volume, the more they're going to do it. And it's a monetary thing. But the people who are in the boats cleaning it up, or the people who know, they would talk to you. But again, that kind of reporting takes time, it takes subtlety, and especially when the company is threatening legal suits and hiring people and making you. I mean, I reported on the North Slope of Alaska, some of the oil up there, and I don't know if you guys know this. We've had all this argument about ANWR. You know, do we drill in the Arctic Refuge? Do we not? Well, there's a test well in the middle of the Arctic Refuge that was drilled in 79. It's called the Kick 1. And Arco and BP and Shell and all these guys kicked in to do it. And they got the Eskimos, who owned a little patch in the middle, and gave them a bunch of money and said, let's go drill. And they drilled it. Tightest hole in the industry. Didn't release any of the results. Didn't want anybody to know what they'd found in that well because it was proprietary. Had the well logs, locked up in the Minerals Management Service office there in Alaska. Well, 20 years later, I'm finding the people who worked on the well and find one guy who knows what was down there. And he was so scared that Exxon was going to come take his house 25 years later when he was hadn't worked in the oil and gas industry in 20 years. He was still afraid that they were going to crush him. And he knew people who they had crushed, that he was mortified that they were going to find out who it was. But it was a bloody dry hole. And for political reasons, they did not want the results of that test well to come out, even though ANWR belongs to you and me. But because they drilled it, they spent the money on it, that information was proprietary, they thought they might have, the reason they gave was, well, if it ever comes up for auction, we'll know where the oil is. And since we spent the money, that money is, we bought that information. We bought that privilege, that knowledge, to go bid on your natural resource. And as just a tidbit on the Arctic, they're getting ready to go drill in the Arctic right now. This summer, Shell is going up there and trying to drill in the Chukchi Sea. My dad was a missionary in this tiny little town called Point Hope, Alaska, after World War II. And they call that their garden. These are still communities that get, a significant amount of their protein from the Chukchi Sea. And there is no known way to clean up oil in broken ice conditions in the Arctic. So then you've got this whole dual layer, melting ice, expands the area, very large deposits offshore, no way to clean up a spill. And they're going at it hammer and tongs. They've spent billions of dollars. Anyway, I'm taking up way too much time.
No. Thank you so much.
Thank you.